All right, hello everyone, and welcome to our April webinar from 1000 Friends. I am going to share my screen and get us started. Today we are going to hear about reclaiming our streets for living together. And as you can see, we have quite a panel of presenters today. So I just first want to take this opportunity to thank Godfrey and Con for sponsoring our webinar series in 2022. I also want everybody to note that if you want credit, there is 1 CM credit available. So be aware of that. And we have several partner organizations represented here today through our panel of speakers. So I'd like to thank AARP, Wisconsin Bike Fed, Alverno College, and UW-Madison for sharing your people with us for our April webinar. Before we jump into the presentation, I just have a few housekeeping things. First of all, we are recording this meeting and we'll be posting it on our website and on YouTube with all the links and things later. So if there's something in the chat that you don't manage to grab onto, that's okay. You can always check it later. Also a reminder that this series is monthly, and our next webinar is on May 18th at noon, where we will be hearing from Michelle Bacchus, James Longhurst, and Amy Lord, all about different ways that communities can support outdoor recreation, especially in the summertime. So you'll hear about how to do community bike rides, how to support people with physical disabilities on bikes through adaptive bikes and other methods, and trail building and all sorts of fun stuff. So if you would like to register for that, Greg will put the link in the chat. And you can also make sure to sign up for our e-newsletter to get updates whenever we have events and presentations coming up as well. In case you're new here, I'm just going to introduce ourselves and our organization a little bit. We are 1000 Friends of Wisconsin. We were founded in 1996, originally to help pass smart growth legislation in the state. And we have been doing now land use planning ever since. We're a nonprofit. We promote healthy communities and equitable transportation and environmental conservation through good land use planning. So that is the work we've been doing for the last 25 years. And for the last couple of years, we've also had the program Active Wisconsin, which I run. I'm the special projects manager here. And Active Wisconsin is a coalition of communities and advocacy groups from all around the state that are implementing active transportation infrastructure in their cities and towns. So that's walking, biking, transit, making sure there are options for everyone. And we do that by sharing resources, meeting quarterly, and advocating at the state level for good policies to support that. The best way to keep up with everything we're doing is to sign up for our e-news. We have a separate newsletter for 1000 Friends and for Active Wisconsin. We don't spam you, I promise. There's usually a long update at the beginning of the month full of resources and events. And whenever we have special things coming up, we'll send out a notice then as well. You can also follow us on social media, Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. You see our handles there at the bottom, where you can see things like Greg's recent photo op with Secretary Pete Buttigieg, and events we have coming up and other resources that we have to share. So in terms of updates, next week, 1000 Friends is hosting an online forum on clean transportation in Wisconsin. It's Wednesday, April 27 from 10 to 12:30. We have a really fantastic group of speakers lined up, including a keynote from Kevin Brubaker of the Environmental Law and Policy Center. And we have panel discussions on active transportation, public transit, and passenger rail from experts around the state in all of those areas. So if you would like to register for that, you can click on the link in the chat or wait for the follow-up to come in your email later. It's on Zoom and it's free. So please feel free to sign up for that. In terms of advocacy, Greg May was on a live podcast for Urban Spaceship in Milwaukee a couple of weeks ago. You can see his picture. He is the one with the microphone speaking under the enormous moose head there. But that was all about reimagining urban highways. There's a advocacy around the country, including in Milwaukee, to take down major highways that cut through cities and replace them with street grids and more neighborhood-friendly infrastructure. So if you want to learn more about that, you can read the blog post on our website, which will be linked in the chat as well. In terms of Active Wisconsin, the big update from us is that we had a network call at the end of March, which included a really great presentation from policy experts from Bike Fed and Rails to Trails that was all about how to access federal money for infrastructure projects. And the presentation was recorded, so you can watch it on our website or on YouTube. And one of the main reasons I wanted to highlight that today was because since that presentation, we have gotten deadlines from WisDOT about when grant funding applications are due. So the next due date is June 3rd for both infrastructure and non-infrastructure projects. And if you want to learn more about that, you can check the WisDOT page that we will include a link to, as well as they have an FAQ PDF with more information. So now I'm going to move into the presentation, Reclaiming the Streets for Living Together. As you can see, we have a whole line of panelists here, all experts who could easily host an entire webinar on their own. But we're just going to hear a little snapshot of what they're doing. So I will kind of drive the bus here and introduce everybody as it comes to their turn to talk. I am Susan Gettert. I am the Special Projects Manager here at 1000 Friends of Wisconsin, where I run the Active Wisconsin program. And yeah, I'm going to get us started and kind of set the stage for what you're going to hear today. So the first thing I just wanted everyone to think about a little bit is how in the last 2 years since the pandemic reached us in a real way, we have seen cities all across the country, including here in Wisconsin, reimagine the way streets and other public spaces are used. One thing we saw a lot of was street closures to traffic. So we saw that, you can see this headline from Milwaukee, for example, where cars were not allowed through and it was only for bicycles and pedestrians. So that provided more space for people to gather safely where the virus was not transmitted as easily. You can also see that there were restaurants that expanded their outdoor seating, such as on the bottom right picture where there are those igloo cover things so that that expanded that into colder weather months. But those of us in planning and in active transportation advocacy have always tried to rethink public spaces and streets because we see them as places for people and not just cars. And so one of the consequences of these street closures was that it allowed more people to see the way some of us are trying to imagine streets and public spaces already. One of the ways that people in the field think about this is complete streets, which if you're not familiar with the concept of complete streets, it is a framework that really centers people and people's needs in street design, not just as a vessel for moving cars through quickly from one place to another. So it's not a one-size-fits-all formula. It's more of an approach that looks at different ways that people get around, different needs that people have. It prioritizes human safety, and it looks at different modes of transportation. So not every complete street looks the same, depending on where it is and how it's used. But you can see in this graphic, for example, that there are cars on this street, but there is also space for bicyclists. There is protected space for pedestrians. There are street trees that provide shade and act as traffic calming. And so that's just one example of the way we can think of streets as being for people and many uses, not just cars. So what we're going to hear from our panelists today is different snapshots from their own expertise and their own work in practice of centering people and human needs. Complete Streets, there's a lot to say about Complete Streets as a policy and how that works in policy space, but we're really going to hear about kind of the human side of it from everyone. If you have questions, please put them in the chat. We will also have time for questions at the end. So I just want to send that reminder quick before we get going with the rest of our speakers. All right, our first panelist is DiPrete Brown, who is Associate Director for Education and Engagement at the School of Human Ecology at UW-Madison. Lori is an expert on many things, particularly global health, especially women and children in vulnerable situations. And today we're going to hear from her about how to look at Complete Streets through the lens of gender equity and mobility of care.
Hi, everyone. I'm really glad to be here and especially to be part of this panel. I was brought into this work by Professor Carrie McAndrews, who would be presenting with me, or if she were free today. And we wanted to look at Complete Streets policy. So we were focusing on policy, but really centering the lived experiences of people as we did so. And we thought that there were two very useful sort of lenses from our own work. And one was a gender equality or equity lens. And it really helps to look at the policy from the point of view of gender. And when we think about liberatory practice or transformative practice, we have to remember that gender-focused strategies aren't always, necessarily liberatory. They can be exploiting gender roles, or they can be accommodating them without making things fair, or they can be truly transformative. And so we wanted to be in the transformative, or if we're accommodating, temporarily, and be moving toward, gender justice in the streets. And that has lots of things, lots of, meanings that you can imagine. And we also, a second lens was this idea of the Sustainable Development Goals. And in some ways, we love the Complete Streets policy because it is such a good, clear articulation of, what it can be for moving through streets. But the SDGs help us to think even bigger about streets. And what if streets were places that live, to live, where the arts happen, where people find community, where they express their culture, where they feel free, and so forth. So it's not just about movement, but being there. And so we had this kind of big idea, and I'll share some of the insights we had by working with a network of people from about 12 different cities to critique and sort of add to the Complete Streets policy and start to imagine what we might do as micro experiments to try out some of those ideas. And again, the reason we chose Complete Streets was because it was in fact so good. Start with the best policy and try to make it better. Next, please. So when you think about Complete Streets policy, it explicitly calls for inclusion related to age, ability, race, ethnicity, and income, but it did not mention gender. There was maybe one mention in an add-on, and we thought an intersectional gender analysis would make these other categories of historical marginalization or injustice, dealt with even stronger. So we didn't want to get into a women instead of mindset, but a gender analysis, in addition to thinking about ability, race, ethnicity, can allow you to do better, both in terms of justice and in terms of getting things right. And I'll explain what I mean by getting things right, designing things right. So we had this notion that streets are a primary form of public space in our societies, that they're unique places for travel, commerce, and culture, that there's a lot of things that determine our health that happen there, not just safety, but air pollution, road traffic accidents, sedentary lifestyles, and so forth. So a lot can happen there. And we thought that this gender analysis and the SDGs could help us quantify this. So just quickly, why gender? 75% of unpaid care work is done by women, often in streets, taking young people or elders or someone from point A to B. Women make up 60% of public transport users, and they often travel carrying things. They often have time pressure, and they may be less likely to have cars. Next, please. So the gender analysis helped us look at patterns of mobility. And this is where it gets interesting, because doing the fair thing is also better transportation science, if you will, because what we found was men had certain, in general, generalizing, men had certain travel patterns to go from work, home to work and recreation. Those were the two categories. But when we looked at other things people do, going to work, recreation, there's this huge category called care work. And women were doing that, and they were chaining trips to make all these things happen. So when you study the mobility of care and look at care work, not only do you make things better for women, but you, and see, here's some things people wanted. They wanted more frequent service, easier to make multiple stops, carrying capacity for bikes and buses, and they wanted to be part of the design. And they wanted it to feel safe and be safe. Not just be safe, but if you perceive lack of safety, it's your problem, but to really feel welcoming. But this idea of trip chaining also makes the systems more efficient, and it makes it easier to share those work that have been gendered because everybody can do it. So that's where it gets into this transformative space of being liberatory. We can all do care work, and systems are designed to make it easier for everybody. So that was that was kind of the partie of why I was so excited about this mobility of care as a concept. Next, please. And so some of the things I mentioned earlier, I'll just say briefly. Some other things about gender relate to safety and justice in the transportation system, as well as addressing bias. So here's all the different kinds of reasons why people of all genders and identities might feel less safe: theft, interpersonal violence, harassment. The transportation infrastructure itself can seem unsafe. Sometimes things are moving too fast. And so what seems like a safe bike lane doesn't feel safe, depending on how all of these characteristics are expressed in your experience. So we're going back to, age, race, gender, ability, all of those things that I mentioned. So, and we also really critiqued in this group the idea that incident reports were used to determine, whether things were safe or not. Low number of incidents reports means it's safe. And in fact, that doesn't capture the extent to which perceptions about all these different aspects of safety would keep people from going out and having an incident, because they're just not in the streets. And, women are not in the streets, or people of non-binary identities are not in the streets with the same kind of freedom. So that is an important indicator, but it's not the whole story. And that was a really important insight. And also thinking about visual landscapes and what they're telling us, and how they either welcome you, honor you who you are, or they can objectify you. And obviously we'd rather have the former. The policy guidance was relatively silent about issues of perceived safety, objectification, and some of these different things. So we really thought there was space to do more. And next, please. Regarding the Sustainable Development Goals, this is a very nerdy thing, and I'll go through it quickly, but there are 17 goals that capture all these aspects of well-being, from food to transportation to opportunity, education, water, and environment, sustainable cities. And we found by sort of crosswalking all of those indicators for each of those categories, we could create a holistic matrix about transportation that would really be great guidance for specialists. So here you have, you've got a transportation engineer, and you're articulating, what does universal access mean? What does efficiency mean? What does safety mean? And what does green mobility mean? And you can walk through the Sustainable Development Goals and related indicators to find ways of measuring and doing that. So we call this SDG 360 analysis. And it's initially overwhelming and later enlightening. And the whole group felt that they got insights about their own work from doing this kind of 360 look at whatever they were specifically looking at with this framework. And so there's more to come. We're working on, practical tools and papers, and we're moving toward looking into how the arts can inform this whole process. Teresa and others are involved in that work with Carrie. They've started the conversations, and it's been really, really interesting work to be a part of. So when you're in a street, think of all that it can do as a resource for well-being, for communities, and for leaving no one out of it.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Lori. Next, we're going to hear from Amber Miller. She is the Associate State Director of Community Outreach with AARP Wisconsin. Amber has experience in nonprofits, economic development, and entrepreneurship, and she holds degrees in business and management, including her MBA. And today we're going to hear about her work with livable communities and what that has to do with complete streets. So take it away, Amber.
Great, thank you so much, Susan. And you could actually just go right to the next slide. So if you're watching us live, thank you so much. One of the things that AARP, of course, is passionate about is our Livable Communities initiative. And really, what is a livable community? In a perfect world, it would be safe and secure for all. So whether you're 8 years old or 108 years old, the community that you're living in and thriving in would have the amenities that you need. So no matter your age, race, gender, income, or other backgrounds, you would walk outside knowing this is a livable community. Next slide. Thanks, Susan. A question, if you would like, you could put it in the chat. So thinking about what makes up, a livable community, we love walkability and green space, transportation options, what would be maybe one or two things that is missing from your community that you would like to maybe integrate or add to your community? And you could just put that right in the chat, no pressure, we'll get to that. Next slide, Susan. So this right here is a survey that AARP did a few years back for people 50 and older, asking them, do you want to stay in your community? As we know, a lot of people are born and raised and grow up and stay within their community, but we also know that some people maybe don't have the support or resources or help to stay in their community. But 77% of adults ages 50 and older agree that they want to stay in their community as long as possible. So of course, with our Livable Communities initiative, that really gets us thinking of like, how can we do that? How can the community, the state, the city, your neighbors help you around? So in the bottom right corner, so for the past 50 years, communities have developed around cars and other motor vehicles as a form of principal transportation. And that's why the complete streets and the work that the local communities are doing on walkability. I live in the city of Milwaukee. If I couldn't drive or choose not to drive, I'm near a grocery store, I'm near healthcare. Not everybody has that luxury. So when we're starting to pave roads, create new roads, create subdivisions and new parts of town, we really have to start thinking about what the resident wants. And if they're not able to drive, how can we better help them? Next slide, Susan. This right here, I'll kind of go through it pretty quickly, is our 8 domains of livability through AARP. This is kind of what we live by. So you could see, outdoor spaces and buildings, transportation, communication, and information to me is huge, especially during COVID. Not everybody has the luxury of having a laptop, internet, and Wi-Fi. So how are we able to make sure that people are getting the information? Civic participation, employment, and pretty much like social participation, respect, and social inclusion. How can we ensure that everybody is being heard? Whether you're 15 years old, 75 years old, we want to integrate people into what we're doing within our community. Just because you're maybe retired doesn't mean that you can't still participate. Your input is so valuable. So all of these 8 domains are really what we live by, especially with our age-friendly communities. And in the state of Wisconsin, for instance, we have the village of Greendale and Shorewood and Wausau, Wauwatosa, all of that can be found on our website. But these are communities who are committing 5 years of research and surveys and getting people together to put an action plan together to say, how can we make our community the best livable community for all ages? Next slide. Just right here, just some stats, probably not surprising that by 2030, the number will reach 73 million Americans, and pretty much 1 in 5 will be over the age of 65. So that's the reason why being a livable community is so important is I'm aging every day as everybody else is. I'm not married, I don't have children, and I have to start thinking about the next 20 years and how that's going to look. I don't have a huge support system if I need to go to a doctor's appointment or walk to the grocery store. So these are things that we think about daily. Next slide. Just once again, people are desiring to age in place. We also have to remember housing is not suitable for aging in place. There's older houses that have lots of stairs or a house that's too big. And now it's for one person living in a bigger house doesn't make sense. Streets are unsafe. There's a lot of reckless driving or uneven concrete, lack of transportation options, and then other factors, including like health issues, isolation, and other issues. So these right here, of course, is why the Livable Community Initiative is so important. Next slide. So this right here, just the problem, we've been talking about, we live in a society where if you don't have an automobile, it's kind of strange. I think also public transportation, or if you don't have a car, is kind of frowned upon. I live in the city of Milwaukee. So we just have to make sure that we're keeping pedestrians in mind when we are working on complete streets or similar initiatives. And then also keep it in mind of, crossing the street. Is there enough time? Are sidewalks being shoveled? Are they being salted? We have to keep people in mind, especially if they are walking and using our streets. Next slide. This right here, AARP also is really big, believe it or not, economic development and placemaking. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. But these right here is something that we did in partnership with Team Better Block. But you could see kind of on the left side in Iowa, just adding a painted double line increases the visibility of bicycle lanes. We do have bicycle lanes, but they're not maybe as noticeable. And then also on the right, the two-way cycle tracks. So once again, you might already have these in your community, but what are ways that maybe we can bring more bring it more to life, that so people are noticing that there is a traffic lane for bicycles and or walking. Next slide. This is a pop-up demonstration. I love when communities are activating space that has maybe not traditionally been used or not used for a while. So this right here is kind of before and after. On the left, a project done in Fort Wayne, Indiana. So they had like a before, kind of, you could kind of see the sidewalk, kind of lackluster, not a lot of, activation when it comes to having stuff there. So they came up with a proposal on the right of like, how can we bring life to it? How can we bring it more as a destination where people want to come here and interact with each other? So next slide. So this right here is the after. So you saw the before, probably similar to a lot of places in our cities, cement, kind of dreary, and right here just activating that space and bringing people to space that maybe they don't traditionally go to. They're meeting new people, they're getting exercise, it's bringing life to maybe a part of town that's been distressed for the past couple of years. So this right here is just a really, I think, great way of innovative ways that you can bring life and attention to walkability and bicycles. Next slide. Right here, just super quick, the AARP Livable Index. You could put your address in there, you could put your zip code in there, and it kind of gives you a whole list. If you go to the next slide, this right here, I just put in my address, and on a scale of like 1 to 100, 100 being the best, I received a total score of 58, but like housing, transportation, health, there's certain aspects of my neighborhood that maybe our city needs to work on. You can also compare it to your neighborhood, to somebody else's neighborhood, but this is really great to kind of get feedback of like, if you're moving to a new house or moving to a different part of town, how everything is going when it comes to the livability index. And next slide. Just resources. I love giving out resources. Please check out the Livable Communities website and AARP. It'll talk not just about walkability, biking, but just a tremendous amount of things that you could do in your area when it comes to placemaking and pop-ups. So I definitely encourage you to visit there. And next slide. And that is my contact information. That was a very quick overview, but hopefully kind of get your mind thinking of, maybe some things that you could do in your community to bring people together. And there's my contact information. And then Susan, I'll turn it back over to you.
Thank you, Amber.
Thank you.
I was thinking about my neighborhood and we could really use some sidewalks, but
yeah.
Anyway, great. Our next speaker is Caressa Givens. She is a City of Milwaukee Advocacy and Projects Manager with the Wisconsin Bike Fed and has 8 years of combined experience as a safe routes educator, bike share programming manager, and community active transportation advocacy organizer for Complete Streets. And so today we're going to hear about some engagement projects she has done in the City of Milwaukee related to their Complete Streets policy, which is award-winning. It was recognized, I believe, in 2018 as one of the top 10 Complete Streets policies in the country. So take it away, Caressa.
Thanks, Susan. Can you hear me okay? Great. So I'm just going to share a little bit about what's going on in the City of Milwaukee, especially around Complete Streets, and hopefully it'll kind of give you a real time example of how some of these things are being implemented in southeastern Wisconsin, Milwaukee County. And I'll share some of the interesting things that have happened, positive things, but also like lessons learned and challenges along the way. So next slide.
Sorry, it's stuck.
Oh, it's okay. So
keep talking. I'll stop sharing and start again.
This is a beautiful picture anyway. As Susan's figuring that out, I'll just kind of explain to you all that, yes, we did pass a Complete Streets policy at the City of Milwaukee in 2018. And we worked on that with organizations and residents in the City of Milwaukee and the City of Milwaukee Department of Public Works, because originally it was a policy that was kind of came out of the government agency area. So is bore out of that I guess department, but very quickly with the support of incredible advocates like Jessica Weinberg, who's now the Milwaukee County Trails Coordinator, and other members of the Bike Fed, we really came to the table and said, you really got to get more people involved before you try to pass this policy at council. And so that's what happened. We got a grant to work with a coalition of community organizations, getting out into the community and talking about Complete Streets, the policy, and also what people wanted to see out of the policy. So they really helped essentially curate or write this policy. You can see in pictures here, we have residents who are engaged in walks, talking about when we want the policy to pass, engaged in bike rides, etc., and doing information sessions. So that's really critical in advancing a policy. Next slide. We also did activities like this particular program called Safe Passages, which just invites residents to come out and experience a corridor that's slated for project changes, and then the project goes through, and we actually do that walk and bike ride after the project has happened. And we had a lot of really great outcomes there, with people saying, "Oh, I didn't know what Department of Public Works does. These residents are experts in their own way. So, these little attention to details I didn't know about as an agency worker." Next slide. So along with passing a policy comes obviously having to implement the policy. So this is really the bulk of this presentation. With the remainder time I have left, I just want to remind folks that if you do not involve residents in the development of any policy, whether it's Vision Zero or whether it's Complete Streets, your policy is it's considered, in my mind, trash unless you do that. But even deeper, as Lori was explaining, when you get into the implementation process, who are those people that you're focused on? I really do like this focusing on the mobility of care, the caretaking community, or people with disabilities, elders, children. How are they essentially informing the implementation of a safe streets policy? In this particular opportunity, right after we passed this policy, we were able to work on an implementation process with the City of Milwaukee, with the Department of Health, Department of City Development, and a host of other organizations, including our Complete Streets Coalition that was there to help pass this policy and write it. So we came up with the Complete Streets Health and Equity Report, which includes qualitative and quantitative information about how the city is advancing the policy. And you can find that on the city's website. Next slide. So this is like, you know, within that Complete Streets Health and Equity Report, the original launch, we did put some ground rules down for how to engage, how the city is supposed to be engaging with residents in order to produce equitable outcomes. This by no means is something that we've achieved to the nth degree, but it's something that residents can clearly see as a way to leverage for the things that they need, especially if they don't feel like their needs and interests are being met. Next slide. We also worked with artists during the implementation process for placemaking opportunities. You know, Amber talked about some work that AARP is doing in communities to not only make it safer for people to get around, but also provide a vibrancy amongst communities. This is a project that was actually done in the middle of a corridor as opposed to a crosswalk painting, which actually has a lot more restrictions in terms of what you can put in a crosswalk, because so many people are using that intersection, including people who are walking. Everything from like not using messages to using certain types of paint materials really kind of hindered the process of placemaking. So we tried to open this up during this implementation process to model a mid-block mural exercise. And so we're going to be publishing a how-to guide for this for everyone in the city of Milwaukee, because even when I started this process, it was really challenging. And now we know more. So next slide. And through this process, we started to see more implementation of safe streets design. As Susan mentioned, we did create a active streets program where we closed off parkways with the county and also local streets to give people some relief during the pandemic. But also the Bike Fed really encouraged the city of Milwaukee to think about what are some of these things, like, for example, when Lori was talking about the caretaking community or people across the gender spectrum who feel safer or less safe in public space. So just because you close a street down, is it actually really good for that community, the people that live there feeling most vulnerable? So this has been kind of a slow process, but we've also encouraged the city to come up with a multi-phase process that ends in real infrastructure. In addition, we've also launched a Child-Friendly Cities program with the city of Milwaukee to make sure that children are involved in the decision-making process when infrastructure dollars come on the table to implement directly around their school community. So you can see that we've started that program really strong. The city was really inspired by it, and now they're allocating local dollars towards the program instead of federally funded, state-funded grant program funding, which can take a lot longer, as some of you know, and can be an arduous process. Next slide. So we also created materials that help people understand what are the things in their community that can improve the neighborhood and the built environment. So everything from street trees to street lighting, parklets, also basic pedestrian and bicycle infrastructure, creating that in multiple languages, and also providing a booklet that can be, that's a tangible item to reference, and it's in every single public library branch in the city of Milwaukee. So these are all these collective ways that we're trying to raise a consciousness in the community. Knowledge is power, right? In order to implement safe streets. But of course, there's a lot more that has to be done in order to focus really on some of those more vulnerable members of the community. And so this is the tip of the iceberg when it comes to, you know, the work that's being done on the ground. And so, yep, next slide. So this is just some images of some of the work that's been done over the last 3 years to get more people more involved in across the city of Milwaukee in implementing safer streets. And it's been really great so far. And I'm happy to say that, this year we're working on a mobile parklet project that's going to be going down in 3 different neighborhoods to encourage the city to invest more money in active streets for business, which is sort of like a parklet program. More emerging businesses across the city have a hard time paying for these things. So we're going to be doing a pilot with them to encourage more placemaking opportunities, like I said, in emerging areas or emerging businesses across the city, business districts across the city of Milwaukee. Next slide. So there you have it. That's my contact information. I try to get through this as quickly as possible. There's much more to be said, but if you have any questions, please feel free to ask. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Caressa. I do realize that with so many people with so much expertise, there's kind of a fire hose of information coming at you all today. So please avail them of those opportunities to ask questions later. Remember, if you have questions, you can put them in the chat. And just know that this is the tip of the iceberg in terms of their knowledge and experience. All right, our final panelist today is Joyce Tang Boyland. She is an associate professor of psychology at Alverno College in Milwaukee. She has her PhD from UC Berkeley. Joyce she grew up in Massachusetts and went to college there, but she has lived in many places, including Austria, Switzerland, Taiwan, and the People's Republic of China. And it was after moving here that her eyes were open to structural inequities linked to the assumption of car ownership. Joyce studies and teaches about aging and disability, cultural psychology, and environmental psychology. So she's going to wrap this up today by discussing, sharing some thoughts about the psychology of effective citizenship and collective action.
Hi, my name is Joyce Tang Boyland. I teach in the psychology department at Alverno. And we also have at Alverno the 8 signature abilities, and each one is a department, including effective citizenship. So that's the department that I'm active in there. My wonderful co-presenters have just been talking about how we make decisions about how land is used and how people can be involved. Next slide. So here are a couple of quotes that I'm not going to dwell on that show that these things matter in human psychology. Urie Bronfenbrenner is probably the most well-known psychologist who advocated for thinking in terms of the big picture shaping human development. And he recognized decades ago that land use matters and community engagement matter. The upshot is that sprawl and high traffic stroads aren't good for humans, and being able to engage in their local places is good for humans. Next slide. So this is a useful book. You can skip to the next slide. All right, so I don't have a lot of time, but the research shows that complete streets are good for society. So if you need data to support a complete streets proposal, a systematic review paper is a good place to start. The authors of this review systematically gathered and evaluated all of the relevant research linking the built environment and social capital, and found that some things are correlated and some things aren't correlated. Surprisingly, density is not correlated with a strong social fabric, but walkability is. So how does this happen? First, welcoming streets are just easier to love and to pour your heart into. Second, when streets are welcoming, they're safe, attractive, restorative, and useful, people are just out more, on foot, not behind a screen. And they're in a better mood. Because in fact, good streets actually improve your mood. Repeatedly bumping into familiar people makes you feel more connected and more at home. And if you're in a better mood as well, your encounters will be friendlier too. It is a virtuous cycle. And then when you have social cohesion, you're set up for people to be productively involved in their communities, which is another way of saying that having streets that people love and where people meet people, that encourages the accumulation of social capital, and they just make a place work better. Next slide. So I know there are a lot of recommendations out there for how to press policy forward. So I'm not going to give you the usual advice, but rather some recent research findings that I think are relevant to working in the political and social environment that we find ourselves in these days. So the first fact is we see how people attack and dehumanize each other. It's all over the news. We hear about it from people we know on social media, et cetera. This is all true. But the good news is that we consistently overestimate how hostile the other side is. They think that we are worse than we actually are. And at the same time, we think that they are worse than they actually are. And this is the same whether you're on the left or the right. It's useful to remember that there are many more complex people out there than it seems like. The second fact is that people consistently underestimate how possible it is to find win-win solutions. So we actually have to find a way around that. And fortunately, on the right side, classic studies on the way that human social networks work point to the importance of connections between regular people. There's a classic paper called The Strength of Weak Ties. So these are connections not between people at the centers of power, but regular people communicating with each other. These are what are called bridging ties that bring out the humanity of people who support different ideas and policies. On the left and on the right, the centers of power can't change their minds. They're structurally prevented from changing their minds because that's their brand and that's how they make their living. But on the left and on the right, the followers on whom those leaders depend can think carefully and can shift on specific issues, even if they do feel the need socially to maintain their social identity as a whole. And this includes all of us. We all follow somebody and we all have identities that we consider important to retain, but we all can think about things and change our minds when we connect with other people. So remembering that people think that we hate them and that we want them to lose, playing into other people's expectations of us just causes them to dig in their heels, and it's not productive. What gets results is connecting deeply with regular people and getting to the root of what people are afraid of and addressing that. This takes work. It's going to take a long time before you get past people's talking points that they've been fed. But it takes time and attention. So the third recommendation is that in all of this, it helps to find as much common ground as possible. This helps the second point too. It helps to think of each other as human beings who like each other, or at least like something about each other. Because people are willing to listen to people who listen to them, and people listen to people who are willing to change their own minds. So let this be an encouragement to you to be a bridge, to nourish your own complexity and find and appreciate other people's complexity. And this might have a bonus of helping policies to move forward that are good for everybody. Thank you.
All right. I'm going to stop screen sharing. We do have some time for questions. Because I had my slides up, I have not been able to follow the chat. Greg, have you been keeping track of questions?
Sure. Yeah, there was one particular question I saw earlier that Karen was asking, I think specifically during Carissa's presentation, but I guess it could be a question for everybody, which are, when we think about success in the complete streets world, we often think of, specific examples that do work, but it's actually also valuable to learn about things that haven't worked. So, from your experience, are there things that don't work that people kind of assume will be more helpful than they actually are in terms of, creating complete streets in this environment?
Was that a question for me, Greg?
It's kind of open-ended, but I think it was asked during yours.
Okay. Well, I did message Karen separately, but I can tell people, I guess what we really noticed that doesn't work is, and it's often done, especially in government agencies, because when they have projects that are associated to, like, connected to a grant, or maybe they're running a lean team, the type of engagement that is really necessary to mobilize, to advance for change, it takes time. And I think that's, to Joyce's point, there's these complexities amongst the population that we really need to get at in order to find shared value amongst all people, no matter their persuasion. So no matter what we're talking about, I think the rule of thumb is, if the local government agency presents it, comes up with all the ideas because they're the experts, people are often automatically turned off by whatever it is, even if it's the best thing for them and could be good for all persuasion. So I think that as much as possible, whenever possible, partnering with really strong organizations outside of local government agency that can help guide along a process to get more residents involved in the decision-making processes, the policy processes, is really critical. You will find more shared value if that happens, but it's hard because there are some well-intended people working in government agencies that are often tied, their hands are tied by the existing, probably archaic, dated processes, political climate, etc. So yeah, I hope that helps answer the question.
I have a thought that might make this a little less apple pie. I think that part of why it's not so much people are for it or against it is a lot, that happens. And I think when you get to one size fits all solutions, that doesn't work. When people get the idea that that's coming to their town, that doesn't work. And if you can never have the first meeting early enough. I mean, people always want to be at the first meeting. And even when you invite them, it's like, why didn't we weren't here sooner? So getting the conversation started. But the other thing I think that is more of at the idea level is sometimes when we design things with good intentions, and we don't really then take like a really suspicious look at our design. So think about a car, they crash test them. They try to destroy them before they get out there and give them to you. And so we really need to crash test these kinds of ideas about streets. One maybe silly example is, you have an app that's really wonderful because it helps people figure out which street is, safe to walk on because there's other people. And that's great, but that can also be used by someone who is trying to find a victim who's isolated, right? So like, are we really thinking about misuse of tools as well, so that we can really kind of error-proof things and think about privacy, think about almost a paranoid analysis of things to really crash test the idea so that you don't have unintended negative consequences of something that seemed, so obviously a good idea.
Great. I wanted to say also that I realized as soon as all of our presenters started talking that I should not have said that, oh, we're people focused, not policy focused in this presentation, because really that wasn't true at all. One thing that I was really thinking about as everybody was talking was that policies really should come from people, like they're people first, people centered first. That is what should inform the policy. And that might seem obvious, but I don't think that's always how it happens. And for those of us in the nonprofit sector, if we're doing our jobs right, like Chris was saying, we are connecting people on the ground in these communities with the larger entities that are responsible for doing the research, such as institutions of higher learning, and also the government entities that are responsible for implementing the plans and the infrastructure. So great. Are there more questions? I don't see any. I did see a comment from Steve that each of our speakers could do their own full-on webinar, and I heartily agree. But I think this was a good taste, at least, of what they have to offer and their expertise. Absent any more questions, I just want to, oh, those ones just popped up. Hold on. Let me see what it says. Our city policy is redoing old no sidewalk streets, always with sidewalks, and taking away our parking. I'm sorry, I'm having a hard time reading this. If you want to unmute yourself and just ask, please feel free. Lisa?
Hi. Yeah, we've just gone through a city policy meetings, several policy meetings in 3 months' time of removing, we're in an old rustic neighborhood with no sidewalks, and the city wants to put sidewalks in, and we're trying to get them to do a parkway or a Woonerf because we already use the street. As a kind of a walking, jogging, biking, it's very low traffic. And very low use. And we have never had an incident with pedestrians or anything. We have disabled, we have wheelchair people that are using the street. And they are just, they've dug in their heels. We've got an alderman that's not willing to work with us. But I was wondering if there was more information. You know, I've been online, we've been trying to find more information about shared street design and Woonerfs and to make this street more of a parkway with permeable pavement. This is within 100 feet of the lake. And we're very concerned about the environment and all the runoff that they're going to add with adding all these sidewalks. And we want something a little bit more unique. And plus it's an old Indian street from hundreds of years ago. So we've got a lot of things in the picture, but I'm looking for resources that we can maybe focus on and use to help our cause to become different than just, you know, the plain old neighborhood with a sidewalk. You know, we want something a little more friendly, where we do have space where we can gather and sit and do art and or see performance or whatever. And we're not, this is a very rurally residential neighborhood. There's no through traffic. Anyway, I'm just curious if there's anything out there like that.
Well, I'll make a comment. I know a little bit about the particular case, and we don't need to get onto all the details. I'll make two comments. One is, you know, the context specific kind of research is important here. So you want to, you know, you want to design something, and you can't just, there's not just sort of one article that proves this or that. You have to kind of do that multi-factor analysis. And I think some of the things Joyce said are relevant too, you know, when you're having these conversations about the complexity of people and looking for win-wins and so forth. You know, and I think I think we all need to educate ourselves more about, you know, the idea of complete streets is not one size fits all solutions. And I think it is still evolving. And so I would just encourage you to get into that dialogue and try to do some really specific place-based research. And, you know, everybody really assuming the best intentions of others, you know, is really important to get to an optimal space. Joyce, I don't know if you have any more, or Carissa, any more insights about these. You know, the idea of sidewalks being very controversial is quite common, and I'm sure Carissa or Joyce know more about that than I do.
That is true. It's also 12:59. So I think just about everyone who presented here left their contact information on the slides. So, and I see that in the chat, I have Amber and Carissa in particular encouraging anybody to reach out to them. So I'll make sure that that information is included when we follow up with the recording and the notes from the webinar. So I just want to thank everybody once again for coming. There's Joyce's information as well. We'll make sure that gets to you. My email is susan@1kfriends.org, so anybody is welcome to reach out to me and I can connect you with resources also. Thank you again for coming. Please remember to sign up for the May webinar on the 18th and check our website, our social media, and sign up for our newsletter so that you know of everything coming up and resources that we have to share.